Oh, we're live. Hi. I hope everyone's now in this room. If you've been with me on Zoom calls before, I usually say, come in, take your coat off, sit, say hello to the person next to you. I hope you're all well and been enjoying. I amuse myself, John. I hope everyone's been enjoying the Festival of Ideas and these today and last night on basic income. Welcome everybody. I'd like to thank the people from the Festival of Ideas. In particular, I'd like to thank Jeff Crocker and Nick Pearce for helping put on all these great sessions. I hope you've been enjoying it. We're getting towards the end of the day now, and we've got a fantastic lineup of people. To say, I'm Neal Lawson. I'm the Executive Director of Compass, and we've been interested in basic income for quite a while. We've been doing some great research with people like Stuart Lansley and Howard Reed, and you can find that on our site. I might put that in the chat box. And also, we launched earlier this year, quite fortuitously, the basic income conversation. So that was a kind of national debate about basic income, and which we launched just before the COVID crisis, which has accelerated stuff, which is what we're going to be testing with our fantastic panel. And our panel is Polly Toynbee, a wonderful columnist from the Guardian. Lovely to see you, Polly. And then we're going to hear from John Cruddas, who's the Labour MP for Dagenham and Rainham. And then last but not least, you can never get enough Guardian columnist, John Harris. I don't think any of us are kind of zealots for basic income. We're all more or less interested in it, some more critically. So hopefully this will give a good final reflection on where we're at in a kind of COVID, I don't want to say post-COVID world yet. We came into this knowing and thinking about basic income. It's had a big impact on the debate. Where are we now? What do we think about it? What about the desirability and feasibility of some kind of basic income? So some time each. Polly, if you want to go first, fantastic to see you, and thanks so much for being on it.
Thanks, Neal. Well, I've always been interested in basic income, but I've never quite seen a way in which it might work. We've had a kind of experiment, haven't we? And furlough has been a bit of a taste of it, of how it might feel. And it certainly seems to have had very wide public support and consent. And that taking it away is going to lead to a huge shock, hundreds of thousands more thrown onto unemployment. I think that's going to be the end of Rishi Sunak as hero of the hour. I think that a lot of people who have never been anywhere near the dole or benefits before are going to find out for the first time that there is no safety net, or at least it's so full of holes, and so many people have fallen through it already, and so many more are about to. They're going to discover what it means to have one of the lowest benefit systems amongst equivalent countries. They're going to find what it's like when it doesn't cover your rent. You think there's something called housing benefit, and there isn't really, or not so as you'd notice in lots of the places where people live who are going to be out of work. A lot of people are going to find themselves for the first time going to their local food bank by the end of the week to feed their children. So it's a moment, you could say, which should be ripe for ideas like universal basic income. The idea that there should be a net that nobody falls below will seem very appealing to some people. On the other hand, we are going into very hard times. We can borrow lots more. The IFS has said so today. That's reassuring, saying, spend, don't worry about paying down the debt for the time being. Nevertheless, priorities for spending are going to be very tough indeed. It's going to be really important that the people who need the money most get it. We know about how bad disability benefits are, how appalling life is for a lot of disabled people and for carers. I'd put them very high priority. But children above anything. The fact that children have been hardest hit in the last decade, our book, The Lost Decade, 2010 to 2020, looking at what austerity did, most shocking of all is how hard children have been hit in the last 10 years. And I would put them very high up in the priority for where spending should come next. Think about UBIs, it does have very heavy dead weight. You're going to get people like me or John or any of us. That would seem to be very wasteful at a time when there is so much real need and real suffering. There are lots of other things you might do with the money. I think we heard earlier somebody talking about a job guarantee. I think that would be a very good start, but absolutely everybody is guaranteed that they will get a basic income and a basic job. We saw the beginning of the Future Jobs Fund under the last Labour government, but it was swept away as soon as the Tories came into power. They're bringing back something called Kickstart, again for young people, but perhaps there should be something like that for everybody to retrain, to work, to get the support they need. Labour's New Deal, when they came in 97, was very productive and very good in helping getting people back into work. But it was expensive, but it was a good way of spending money. And I think those might be more fruitful ways forward, perhaps, than handing out money to some people who might not need it. But raising the benefit level itself, the universal credit level, that's essential. So that and making sure that it covers people's rents, or we're going to have mass evictions. I would want to see Sure Starts for children brought back as a high priority. I'd want to see those 3,500 Sure Start children's centres brought back and have them really up and running, all singing, all dancing, with everything there as support for families right from the day that a baby's born, and wraparound schools that have breakfast, lunch and tea. Hooray for Marcus Rashford. I put that as a very high priority too, and restoring child benefit to its previous levels and more. All of that I would certainly want to do. Now, my worries about why, I mean, I think all of those things might gain plenty of public support. One of my worries about basic income is that I think it goes against the grain with an awful lot of people. We've had 10 years of a very far right government that has, Ian Duncan Smith has encouraged every kind of unpleasant view about people on benefits of all sorts, being scroungers and skivers. We've had all those vile Benefit Street programmes. We've had the Tory press hammering out a message that anybody receiving any kind of benefit is feeding off other taxpayers. And the people who often feel that most strongly are people who are themselves low paid and are made to think it's not true, but there are people lying around getting much more money than they are. They're pushing brooms and doing some lousy, rotten jobs. And they think that there are people on benefits earning more, all the same as them, for doing nothing at all. So there is a lot of ground to be made up to persuade people that the benefit system is secure, is fair, works well, picks up the people who really need help and encourages people back into work who can work, for whom there are jobs or retraining or whatever. And we're a long way off that. The emotional pull is still to be suspicious of benefits. And I have a feeling that the idea that we suddenly dish out very large sums of money, irrespective of people's circumstances, would not go down terribly well, whereas it would be much easier to give the support to people who need it in a more targeted way. Final point, UBI wouldn't be any simpler. The lie about universal credit that Ian Duncan Smith kept saying is we wrap up 6 complicated benefits and put them into one. It was never true. All of those 6 benefits still had to be assessed. In fact, they were paid as one, was a minor administrative efficiency. But it isn't true that you can simplify the benefit system unless you make it either super generous, so everybody gets the maximum that anybody could possibly need, or super mean, a kind of flat rate, where lots of people with special needs, whether that's because they're disabled, because they've got children, because they've got high rents, would get themselves mowed down by a flattened system. So I think we should leave out the idea that there is any simplification available, but we should bear in mind priorities. I'll leave it there.
Okay. All right, brilliant. Thanks, Polly. Some scepticism there about basic income. And just before we go to John, so I think universality is one of the reasons I find it so attractive. Actually, I mean, you can claw someone in the chat said you claw the money back from the rich people through the tax system, but you end means testing, that's one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of it and looking at it, because I hate means testing and the horrors that puts people through. And I quite like universality, Polly. Like the NHS, there are things which we shouldn't judge people by. And there are there are quite modest entry level versions of basic income that Custom the RSA and others that have been modelling, which aren't furiously expensive, but at least do introduce the principle. I'm sure other people in the chat, and do put any questions you've got into the question.
Neal, can I just say something to you? When you say that, it doesn't do away with means testing, does it?
No, there was still an element of means testing around disability and housing in particular, but not around fitness and around working and forcing people into jobs they don't want to do and acting punitively around the jobs market. Around disability and housing, people with those needs would need more support than the rates that are being suggested by Compass and the RSA. So there would be some means testing, but around housing and disability, not fitness for work. John, where's your head on this? You've been interested, quite sceptical, John Cruddas?
Yeah, I've been interested in it for a very long time, and I really enjoyed actually the conversation around its links to the welfare system that preceded this session, because it touched on some of these issues around child benefits and uprating disability, dependence, and etc. I also enjoyed the Mayor of Stockton talking about upset the setup. Now, obviously, it's a big, powerful idea, UBI. We had a debate in the House of Commons actually this morning, so it is being mainstreamed into Parliament. My view is I don't think support for UBI should necessarily be seen as an ideological or political test, because it has advocates and opponents within every single brand of political philosophy, within utilitarianism, within rights-based models of justice, within Republican traditions. Rather, it should be about the assumptions that inform the thinking around it in terms of what we're trying to achieve here. Obviously, the idea has been around for centuries, born of religious conviction, a sense of a human inheritance, or say various human rights approaches. But over recent years, it's risen up the radar because of two basic issues related to the demand for labour. First, before the pandemic, amongst a growing movement, it emerged as an economic and social antidote to automation. And second, after the virus struck, many embraced the idea to remedy the fallout from contagion. So the initial point I'd make is you don't have to support UBI for every reason suggested by all its supporters. For instance, you could remain cautious about embracing UBI on the basis of estimates and assertions about the end of work and the march of the robots, whilst also being sympathetic to UBI and providing a universal floor in the context of the pandemic and the desire for a more humane form of welfare support, or social security, I should say. Look, the second point I'd make relates to the widespread support for UBI. Again, I would introduce a notion of caution here. All sorts of people, often bitter political opponents, support UBI for very different political purposes. Friedman, Hayek, Charles Murray, Richard Nixon embraced UBI as a vehicle to roll back the state and replace it with an individualized transaction period in the state and the consumer. Others, the Silicon Valley titans, arguably want it to offset their personal responsibility for structural unemployment and therefore passport responsibility onto the state. On the left, the traditional case has tended to focus on the basic human rights of a level of subsistence to guarantee freedom. Tom Paine, Bertrand Russell, Gail Braith, Lyndon Johnson, etc. Now, there's an obvious danger here. Libertarians love it, as do the tech giants, assorted tech utopians, as well as on the progressive left. Not everyone can necessarily be right here, so we need to tread carefully when advocating a policy when your most hostile opponents also embrace it, but for totally different reasons to secure dramatically different outcomes. Now, a way out of that ideological confusion, and that has been explored today, is to study the numerous basic income initiatives that are underway. Alaska, oil dividends, modern UBI pilots, Finland, Scotland, Canada, Oakland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and the like. In North America, there's also a very lively debate about the merits of UBI compared to a federal jobs guarantee. You have Democrats like Kirsten Gillibrand, Cory Booker, Bernie Sanders arguing as part of a growing movement to embrace the idea of a federal jobs program rather than UBI, similar to old New Deal employment programs, where you'd establish a level of subsistence through work to cover housing, food, childcare, health insurance, and pension arrangements. Now, I'm personally quite sympathetic to that, but others like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton appear to be moving towards the question of UBI. I just want to make a couple of points about the question of technological disruption in the case for UBI, because we hear loads about how the robots are coming, work is ending, or at least being fundamentally transformed, and we'll witness a wholesale replacement of humans by machines. If so, the case for UBI to ensure that everyone is protected and can live enhanced, purposeful lives is very strong. But is it true? And for me, this is the least persuasive of the case for UBI. Throughout history, we've heard stories about how work is going to end. And today we're surrounded by a lot of this talk. Yet once you investigate the actual literature on the future of work, you find that a lot of the headlines around an imminent collapse in the demand for labour tend to derive from a single highly contested academic source. In 2013, Osborne and Frey suggested up to half the British jobs could be automated, and the Bank of England picked that up to assert that 15 million jobs could be at risk. Countless headlines followed, but this is a highly contentious report. McKinsey, for example, suggests that only 5% of jobs could be automated. Osborne and Frey don't consider new jobs created by automation and underplay the politics of it all in terms of an appreciation of forms of labour regulation that can help or hinder automation. The OECD, I think, estimated some 9% jobs threatened to be by automation and concluded that automation and digitalisation are unlikely to destroy large numbers of jobs. So the evidence is inconclusive. The robots might not be marching after all. There's little consensus. Evidence is contested, unclear, speculative, and arguably contains serious methodological flaws. There's nothing inevitable here. Technology is not destiny. And there's a brilliant scope paper analysing all the data by Phil Brown and his colleagues down at Cardiff on this that I think is worth a look. So the case for UBI on the basis of automation, I find, is the least strong in terms of the arguments. There's also loads of technical issues that need to be worked through. Is it financially feasible compared to sovereign wealth funds, job guarantee programs, reformed universal credit? What policies need to accompany UBI to ensure just outcomes, housing, statutory wage levels, disability dependence and the like? It seems to me, and Neal, I know you've done a lot of this modelling, there's a body of evidence of the costs and effects of UBI through various economic models, Compass, the RSA, pilot programs, but much of the analysis is pretty inconclusive, actually. It basically concludes that affordability is linked to the level of UBI. It costs more to introduce a more generous payment, but this has more effect. So the scale of ambition appears to define both its costs and consequences. Now, I just want to make a couple of points regarding UBI and the dignity of work, which was touched on in the last section, actually, because the future of work remains a political contest. There's no sort of technological determinism that should kick in here. You can accept and support UBI as a short-term remedy to correct a unique short-term shrinkage in work, but also believe the effects of a virus should be used to challenge capital and rebuild the nature of work and reassert the dignity of labour. And here, I think UBI might hinder more than it helps. So behind the backs of the UBI debate exist profound disagreements about the dignity of labour and forms of determinism within politics. Even if technological change is wiping out millions of jobs, should we just accept it? If we believe in the dignity derived by good work, should we not organise industrially and politically for decent jobs, income guarantees, collective rights, strong unions, decent public services, etc., etc.? Prior to the pandemic, we had record employment levels alongside at least a decade of austerity, flatlining wages, and enduring productivity puzzle. We now face entrenched austerity, Brexit, and a climate crisis. So big ideas are certainly needed, and UBI is one of them. But I would argue, actually, that the crisis didn't start in 2008. On the left, it occurred around 2000, 2001, with the failure of the Labour government to build an effective industrial pluralism, including industrial democracy, economic devolution, proper federal job programs and labour market redesign. 20 years later, following 2008, we're seeing the long-term consequences of this in terms of Brexit, changing class alliances and creeping authoritarianism. So I'd see a role for a form of UBI within a universal humane social security system alongside a form of industrial stakeholding that reasserts the dignity of labour, very much a core characteristic of post-war social democracy. And this could be codified in terms of new forms of economic and social rights for all citizens. Now that's a different approach to the UBI that heralds it as a panacea to confront either automation or contagion, but that seems to me to be the pragmatic point about where the debate might want to go. One final point that best describes my approach is the most persuasive, pragmatic, practical case for UBI delivered by Louise Haag. She suggested that to survive, UBI needs to be rescued from the heads of the polemicist, the populist and the reductionist. And this has created a solve all or solve nothing debate around the idea, whereas the strongest case for UBI is part of an overall anti-poverty strategy rather than a utopian antidote to modern capitalism. And that seems a pretty sensible approach in terms of where we might go from here, Neal.
Okay, brilliant, John. Thanks so much for that. An awful lot in that, and I could totally agree that any proponents of UBI that go down the route of silver bulletism are probably mistaken, and automation and determinism, is not the best basis of having a crystal ball and claiming you can see into the future. Totally agree with all of that. It's got to be part of a whole range of packages of devolution, democratisation, etc., etc. John Harris, you've been listening to that. What are you thinking? Where are you at? You're kind of supportive, but got questions, got more questions, less questions. Where are you now?
Yeah, so I mean, I became acquainted with arguments for UBI and some of the people making them via a slightly circuitous route, which was less about reading kind of theoretical or academic material about UBI. It was really arriving at UBI after having reported, which is a lot of what I do for a living in normal times, directly on questions about work for a start and questions about the benefit system. And having done that to some degree, I then sort of went looking for answers. And this was one of the things, or the key thing that came up really. And I'm going to sort of sound a somewhat controversial note in favor of economic and technological determinism, if you don't mind, which is, I think, although I'm uncomfortable with the idea that the end of work is axiomatic and that's what's going to happen, and as John says, that's a prediction that's been made serially down the years, clearly something is up. We have moved away from the world in which my parents cut their teeth. I think my dad had pretty much the same job. It was a good job, but he had pretty much the same job from when he was about 23 to when he retired. And that's the world that he came from. The post-war welfarist world was a Fordist world, to use that term, was a world in which the idea of sort of long-term, fairly unchanging, dependable work was real for a lot of people. And we don't live in a world like that anymore. We do live in a world in which increasing numbers of people are part of what Guy Standing, the UBI advocate, calls the precariat, and in which people arrive in the labour market, however reluctantly or otherwise, with the expectation and the understanding that work is subject to short-term cycles now, and people drop in and out of jobs, and in the course of a working life, people might hold down 2 or 3 jobs at once, and over time they might have 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 different jobs, and some of that is unquestionably down to sort of matters of simple exploitation and the way that capital, to use a high theoretical phrase, sort of cooks the system so as to limit people's bargaining power and all the rest of it. But a great deal of it is technological. It's to do with the fact that if you're able to survey your inventory and your order books on a minute-by-minute basis, the idea that you would employ someone for years at a time on an unchanging contract is sort of profoundly illogical. Things evolve at speed now and change at speed, and people fall in and out of jobs. And I think it's important to recognise that. And we are, it seems to me, again, without falling for what John Cruddas calls chronocentrism, which is the idea that you live in a uniquely disrupted time. That doesn't preclude the idea that we do live in a time of great disruption. Look at the state of the high street. I mean, that precedes the pandemic, and unquestionably that was due to the migration of a great deal of consumer spend online, and the fact that e-commerce necessarily involves much less human labour. So in that sense, Carl Benedict Frey, who coincidentally I was just transcribing an interview I've recently done with him just before I started this, I think he probably is onto something. So people are falling in and out of work all the time. People's working cycles shorten. And then you're presented with how the benefit system works. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work in that context. The idea that whenever your employment is interrupted for whatever reason, you then have to go through this ludicrously bureaucratic set of demands of filling in forms and registering for this and that, and then eventually in the current system, after 5 or 6 weeks, you may or may not get your universal credit. That doesn't work with the way that technology and the economy work, and people endure huge shocks and end up, at least for a period, borderline destitute. So the number of times I've gone to food banks, and I'm sure Polly Toynbee has had this experience as well, and talked to people who are in work. Clearly, there's a cliched received understanding that to turn up at a food bank, you can't be in employment, because if you were, you wouldn't be there. Well, that's not true. So those two things, it seems to me, go together. You've got a disconnection, really, between the welfare state and how it works and the reality of work and technology and the economy, and that cries out for an answer. I think the other thing, which is much missed in the midst of all this as well, are questions to do with care and caring work, even if it's not formally paid work, in people's lives, and how that sits alongside conventional paid labor. And I think we have to think about that increasingly, again, without wanting to be chronocentric about it. But this is a time in which the age balance of society is changing in fairly unprecedented ways. And people are, unless you want to devolve it all to the state or hand it over to the state, which I don't, I'm uncomfortable with that idea. We are going to, also we might not be able to afford to do this. We are going to have to look after each other, probably more than we did again at the sort of high point demographically of the sort of post-war world, where, you know, people died when they were 60 or 70. And the idea of mutual care and all that perhaps wasn't quite as urgent. So the question then is, well, in a world in which people might have to, or will have to, combine conventional paid waged employment with caring responsibilities, what do you do about that? You know, it can't just be a question of people on this sort of scrappy basis having the odd afternoon off work to care for their friends and relatives who require care. You need an answer. And I think UBI begins to address those things. And then, just to be a bit more topical about this, you take this into the context of the pandemic. Now, one of the first things I reported on in the midst of the pandemic, which is about to happen again, as Polly said a moment ago, was there droves of people who were spending hours at a time, days at a time, trying to get through on the infamous Universal Credit phone helpline and being subject to this 5-week delay. And the system simply couldn't cope with the fact that I think it was certainly hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people, fairly simultaneously were applying for Universal Credit. And again, you think, well, this doesn't work. And again, without wanting to be pessimistic about this, as far as I understand it, shocks like this are going to become more frequent. I'm not saying they're going to happen every year, but we are in the second crisis of capitalism in not much more than a decade. Climate change sows crisis and disruption. And in addition, reading scientific writing about this, the likelihood of pandemics in the near future and future is going to increase. So this isn't going to be the only time we experience this. And you do get to ask him, well, what's going to happen if you hit these sort of convulsive moments with this unchanged architecture around so-called welfare, social security, if you'd prefer, and work? How do you change things to ensure that these great convulsions don't absolutely wreck people's lives? And again, I think UBI might be part of the answer. The other thing is, again, the pandemic returns you to questions about care and about human activity and mutual responsibility beyond orthodox paid labor. You know, what was the signature element of that early lockdown period, which again, I think is likely to return, was all of those mutual aid initiatives that happened just about everywhere, irrespective of people's economic circumstances. People were doing it. And it was good that they did it, because if they hadn't done it, people would have found themselves in pretty dreadful circumstances. Now, how do you free people up to do that in a world in which they will feel, well, I haven't got enough time to do that because I have to clock on at 9 o'clock, and, you know, I work in an Amazon warehouse and I have to be there at 7:15 in the morning and knock off at 5:45 at night, and then I'm too tired to do anything. So again, I think these are really, really salient, pressing questions. Having said that, to answer something Polly said, I don't think this is a conversation about something, you know, that's going to realistically have a sort of thoroughgoing version of it in the next Labour Party manifesto. I prefer to think of it in terms of the sort of long haul and the long view. And the example I always use is that Eleanor Rathbone, the somewhat moneyed social reformer, started campaigning for universal child benefit in 1917. And she got it about 33 years later, because she was prepared to make the case for it as an answer to a lot of the social problems that were all around her. And I think we have to think about it in those terms. And you ain't going to get very far if you sort of conflate the short-term politics of something with its long-term viability. They're two different things. And the only way you ensure the long-term viability is by leaving immediate politics and whatever's in the Labour manifesto to Keir Starmer. And I hope he wins the next election and all the rest of it. But that's not really relevant. The point is, it falls perhaps to people like us to start making the case for something, to start to embed it, and to start to overturn some of those received assumptions about whether or not it might be something that eventually materializes. And that's me done for now.
Thanks, John. A kind of a pragmatic, slightly more than a pragmatic case for universal basic income. So I've been trying to look at some of the questions, but I'm trying to work out how to phrase those back, because we haven't got an awful lot of time left, 20 minutes. So Polly, it seems that there is a kind of, you'd be, an advocate of a more reformist model of what we've got, both for, you and John have got a kind of view that we could probably, job guarantees, changing the welfare system, but just reforming it, the 45 model, whereas, John H would be more, look, there are big things going on. I mean, do you think it's 75 years on from 1945? Is it tweaks to that model that we need, or something bigger?
I think we need both. I think we need the short term and the long term. I think John's quite right that there have to be people like you and Compass, like John Cruddas' work, that thinks big, long term, sees the patterns, the waves coming towards us. I suppose I'm a bit more of a short-termist, really. The thought of 35 years, well, I won't be here in 35 years, makes my heart sink. And I think of the desperate need that, those of us who are out there reporting see all the time. And I think these people can't wait 35 years. But yes, of course, we need both. We need the big argument for real structural change. And if these waves of catastrophe, crises of capitalism really do keep rolling in frequently through climate change, through all the other things that both John's been talking about, then maybe it becomes more and more feasible, and more people see, yes, any kind of minute fine-tuning of a complicated system of benefits with means testing is just too difficult. We've just got to bung the money out through the door quick. But I'm not sure that's sustainable for very long in terms of popular will. You've got to take people with you on benefit systems. You've got to make them feel as they did in 1945 and believe in it. And they believed in the social security system that didn't really exist. They always thought it was contributory. Very little of it was. Pensions were not really, they were paid out straight away. There's always been a bit of myth making to get people to accept a social security system. And maybe we need to be building those myths now around something like this. But I still can't quite see how it works. I can see it around the fringes as an extra in certain circumstances for certain groups of people. But I don't think it solves the two main problems: not nearly enough money in the system, people too poor, and fiendishly complicated. And I'm not sure that I see quite the way around those at the moment.
Okay, and John Cruddas, listening to John Harris, there is a bit of a challenge there about, there are moments like 49, 79, maybe 97 or whatever, where bigger things, do happen, move and shift. Do you buy that some of that stuff from John H about, this could be a more transformative moment?
I do, but I think there is a danger in a lot of these debates to bet the ranch on UBI as an antidote to automation, to pandemic, to climate change. To, you throw it in front of the train if you want, whichever train's coming down the track. And I would say, look, in terms of John was talking about Fordism and the collapse of Fordism, nowhere is that more appropriate than Dagenham, which literally was built around a Fordist model. And since its collapse, we've seen deindustrialization, fascism, the BNP, the humiliations brought on by modern capitalism in a very small community, violence, nihilistic outcomes, all sorts of things. But actually, over the last few years, you are seeing a community being reborn with an agile local state who are prepared to work very hard to bring universities in, to bring new tech state-of-the-art tech developments, film studios, relocating the markets out of central London, bringing thousands and thousands of jobs, billions of investment, if you have the political will, and reimagining a community built around a renewed sense of the capacity and the possibilities around human labour. Now, if you can marry that to a radical, humane social security system that can pass people into and out to allow for the complexities of our modern life, the care complexities of our children and our parents and, you know, our wider extended families, then there is something there. I just don't think, I think there's a danger in this debate that you concede too much. You concede the labour market too quickly to those who've got quite a bit of skin in the game for you to do that. And I just think it's worth exhausting the political contest around the labour market, which Labour Party hasn't done for well over 20 years. There was a great tradition post-war of trying to democratise industry and really built a whole sort of industrial policy around the dignity of labour. Extraordinary developments through a whole generations that informed Labour Party thinking for 30 years. And we jettisoned that. And I don't think we should have exhausted the possibilities contained within a reformed vision of social democracy that isn't just going all in on these new ideas who they are potent, they are important, but it's not an either or thing for me. And I've seen locally how even in the context of a decade of austerity, of crap jobs, whatever, bullshit jobs, whatever you want to call it, out of that, if you have the political will, you can begin to forge something more enduring, creative and humane.
And I think it is that more, you know, nuanced message, which anyone, hopefully people on the call who are, you know, I mean, like me, stronger of advocates of basic income will begin to take on board, you know, that not, you know, it's not a panacea. So John Harris, when you're, you know, traveling around the country, I mean, do you pick up much of an appetite for this? You know, we know that, you know, there's 40 odd UBI sprung up, you know, Andy Burnham's now in favour of it, you know, other mayors are looking at it. You know, the big cities are passing resolutions. There's quite a lot of appetite for it, isn't there? And is that the route? Is that the route?
It's not something. Look, you don't any more than where I live now. I go out among the people that I know, right? Because this has nothing to do with class at all. Just to make this clear, it's not like it's on everybody's lips. Of course, it isn't, because it's only relatively recently, as you've said, that it's sort of moved out of the political margins into being part of the conversation, and they're still quite sort of marginal comment. You know, I write for the comment pages of The Guardian. It speaks to a constituency, but I don't kid myself that it has the clout that often to sort of shape the public conversation. But I think, again, you sort of look at it, not you personally, but one looks at it, if you're not careful, from the wrong end. The point is, I meet plenty of people saying, well, I was on a temporary contract and I've got another one coming up in 4 weeks and I can't afford to feed my family. And I hate the fact that I've come to this food bank. And I meet lots and, you know, increasing numbers of people saying, I find the benefit system absolutely impossible to navigate. And I've been waiting on this call for 48 hours and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I meet lots of people whose lived experience, notwithstanding what John said, does suggest that, and I wouldn't accuse John of this at all, but I think, you know, there have been changes to work and our attitudes to it, which are grounded in technology, such that I think the dignity of labour now very often looks like a somewhat specious idea if you're not careful. You know, I mean, it's not very nice working down a coal mine, but for whatever reason, we applied the myth of the dignity of labour to that, and that worked. People believed in it. But I don't know how you do that to working in a distribution centre or a call centre or working as a DPD driver. I mean, they're all things that, you know, are fairly monotonous, and given the chance, people might not want to do none of them, but they'd certainly want to do less of them. And in the context of the caring responsibilities that I talked about earlier, that strikes me as a pretty good policy goal in the long term. So I think a lot of these things are straw men. You know, there are people who talk about the end of work and all that. And I have been in my writing career somewhat seduced by that from time to time. But I think that, you know, to echo something I've heard John say a lot, I think that cuts across what human beings are like and doesn't work as a vision of the future. But having said that, just to reiterate what I said earlier, I think that doesn't preclude these really, really pressing, urgent challenges that are about deep systemic changes in the world. And the best answer I've heard from them, for all its flaws, is UBI.
And again, I mean, I know that all four of us are proponents of proportional representation, and you don't get many people on the street saying that what they want is proportional representation. I think it's part of our job to work out how to popularise and articulate, you know, some of these ideas. most people weren't running around saying they wanted Brexit, but that happened pretty quickly because fairly clever people pushed at something. So, Polly, I think we're probably getting near towards the end, but what would you like to see? What would convince you from the kind of UBI proponents for you to take it more seriously and give it more consideration?
I suppose sign that there is willingness to put an enormous amount more money into the social safety net in all its forms, some of its services, some of its direct cash. I want to see a tidal wave of public support for what needs to be done. And if you feel that that's there, then maybe that's a time that you can persuade people that UBI is the way to do it. I think on the whole, I feel it goes the other way around. You persuade people about the particular people who really need help, with whom, whether it is people with disabilities, whether it's people with caring responsibilities, whether it's people so low paid that they're in food banks despite working all the God's hours, or whether it's just children and the fact of, the huge swathes of children becoming poorer and poorer. And I think on the whole, it's these human stories, these human events that persuade people that, yes, taxpayers' money should go into these good causes. If you talk in a grandiose way about, well, everybody should have this money, yeah, sure, we'll tax it back from some of the rich people, I think that's a harder sell. So I suppose I'm being practical and pragmatic, really.
I suspect the opposite might be true. I think the danger in what Polly said, for all that it has moral force, right, is that you end up othering Social Security if you're not careful. And you end up saying, well, it's for somebody else. It's always for somebody else less fortunate than you. It's for the, the mythical downtrodden and the deserving poor, And most people don't think of themselves like that. And the great virtue of universal benefits, apart from the practicalities of avoiding all the bureaucracy and cost of means testing, is that's a conversation about everybody. It's why child benefit, while it lasted until George Osborne savaged it, was such a good idea, right? I mean, it's central to my remembrance of growing up in a relatively middle-class home in suburban Cheshire, was going with my mum at the post office every Tuesday or whenever it was in those days, and her coming out with a child benefit money, which was really, really important, right? And that made you feel like you had a stake in the welfare state. And I think that's really, really important. And notwithstanding urgency and everything else Polly talked about, I think you have to think about the future of Social Security like that. Because you can't have a conversation about consent if Social Security is never for the person you're talking to and it's always for someone else.
Can I just say one thing about that? The odd thing about child benefit is it wasn't very popular. Where were the people out on the street to defend it when it was so easily demolished and taken away? In fact, leading up to that, for quite a long time during the Labour years, when you looked at the opinion polling, when you talked to people, a lot of people were saying, why have I been giving child benefit stuff? If they're giving money to people like me, it must be a very loose and lax system. There was a lot of that about, and there was no real protest at how easily that really precious element was swept away.
Okay, well, I'll come back to that. John, you wanted to come in?
Yeah. Despite what I've said so far this afternoon, I'm a relative convert to the case for UBI, actually. A few years ago, I'd have described it as the ultimate neoliberal victory and, allowing capitalism off the hook. So, I mean, I think if this debate can be, the reason why I like it is it refracts so many big ideas through it. Reform of social security, the future of work. What is the question of human dignity? I know John implied that human dignity was a specious argument. I think it's quite fundamental in terms of the
dignity of labour.
He'll come, we'll let him out there.
Including the dignity of labour. But and I think there is a link to PR here, actually, in terms of, especially for in and around Labour, and whether it can coalesce with other political parties and be agile enough to move in and out of some of these big ideas, not with preset outcomes in terms of what, but just being engaged in a plural discussion about political reform, constitutional reform, radical social security reform, labour market reform, because, there is this thing about upset the setup here, and UBI has a key sort of leveraging role to sort of unpack politics, just like PR does. It detonates a lot of assumptions, and that's why I think it's a really useful conversation, even though I'm quite uncomfortable about it, I think it is a really live debate, and it can, like the debate this morning in Parliament, I couldn't get there because I was doing something else, but it had different political parties all coalescing in and around spaces, which is going to be the future, as a precursor maybe for more looser combinations of political parties at elections as well. So there is a cultural issue around this that I like as well, Neal.
John, you were railing about the dignity of Labour, were you?
Yeah, because let's look at it the other way. Let's talk about the indignity of the social security system as it currently works.
Sure.
Unfortunately, the two are sort of locked in some degree of symbiosis, right? And it's indefensible. It's completely indefensible. Now, the point is, the current system of social security is indefensible in its current post-Ian Duncan Smith form, right? Everybody knows the job centre in your town is an alien imposition on your town, and everyone knows it's horrible and punitive and hateful. There's no social consent for it, and it's basically there as a way of saying, avoid this if you possibly can. It's part of the policy approach to the labour market to make people grateful for what they're given, right? But I would argue that even in the supposed halcyon days of social security in the welfare state, it was an offence to dignity then, you know. When I was momentarily on the dole in the 1980s, turning up to that smoke-filled room at what was then called the DHSS, and a fellow behind plate glass standing there saying, "Hello, Mr. Harris, have you done any work in the last 2 weeks?" And me saying no, and then my gyro was coming. That was an offence to human dignity as well, right? And I would rather take out as much of the sort of conditionality and, as I said, the othering of the social security system as possible. There'll always be an element of it. And I think that's a really, really important component part of a conversation about dignity, which is often missed, which is the state as constructed post-war ended up denying people most of their dignity. And that now, because we're in the post-Ian Duncan Smith world, cries out for radical answers.
I agree.
Any final word, Polly?
I agree. Nothing could be worse. Nothing could be worse than our present social security system. It stinks. It's
consensus.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
We've got
consensus. We agree.
We agree on that. We agree on that, and I know John Cruddas agrees on that too. Anything final, John?
No, thanks for having me. I mean, the debate's just got to start. That's why I like the fact that this conference is going on today, just as it's beginning to percolate into Westminster. New coalitions are forming. It's crossing political lines. Let's go for it. You know.
Yeah, and going back to Polly's point about where were the people on the streets about child benefit. I think it was taken away sort of gradually, bit by bit. But if you look at the way the New Labour's reform for the Child Trust Fund, it was a policy idea from a think tank. That's why I'm interested in the UBI labs, in the basic income conversation. These are real people in real places making a case for something and trying to build the level of national consciousness. Polly's right, and support that's going to be necessary. If we're going to do this, it's huge. You can't pretend it's not. And to do a big reform, you need big levels of support right across the country. That's why Compass initiated the basic income conversation and why we're supportive of all of these debates, and because it's beginning to percolate out to different places, which is just what's necessary. And you watch the way, not many people saw it, but the Liberal Democrats passed by a country mile, a policy back basic income at their conference, last month. Huge step really in British politics. I mean, not just the symbolism of the Liberal Democrats being more radical, but looking at basic income as an answer. And I think as the mayors of Scotland, etc., look at this closer, there are more pilots, there are more trials that are run, etc., the more people will begin to look at this. And I think I'll close, and hopefully Nick Pearce is going to be on in a minute, but I'm exactly with John Cruddas. It opens up the question of what the good society and the good life is. It cracks open all of that and enables us to talk about what kind of world do we want to live in, how much time we want, how much care do we want, what is the nature of work, how much we consume, how much democracy should we have, what's our role as citizens. It opens up all of that conversation, which is why it's so beautiful, and why the 517 people on this call, need to keep working on it and thinking about it and talking about it. Just right on cue, as I was about to dry up.
So thank you very well.
Always pleased to see you, but particularly now.
Well, very good to see you too. And I've just been following that conversation. It's such a rich discussion you've just had, and all the trends in our society that you've covered on tech, on care, on the changing labour market, our resilience to pandemic shocks, all of these really important things that you've been talking about. I think they do show that actually, even if you support a basic income or not, the idea of a basic income is something that allows a lot of people to project lots of what they want to see change into society onto a bigger discussion. It's a way in which we can have these plural, open, wide-ranging debates about what needs to change in our economy and our society. And I think in the course of today's discussion, it's been a very global debate too. We've had these films that we've recorded with the Mayor of Stockton and Olli Kangas from Finland. We've had references to experiments in Germany, in the Netherlands, Alaska, and so on. And so there clearly are across the world forces that are being given expression in this debate on basic income, tendencies that are, whether it is about tech or whether it's about poverty, whether it's about labour market exclusion or precarity, that are being given expression in demands for a basic income or a guaranteed income or cognates of basic income, and political constituencies that are sort of arising around these, often Green parties, but also the Liberal left. And interestingly, very interestingly there from John Cruddas, that people thinking about these debates not as antithetical to how we think about work or a wider resettlement of our economic and social system, but maybe much more complementary to it. If we can think intellectually in plural ways, that may also be a way forward for us too. I think from our early discussion today, we had a lot of consensus on fiscal policy, that monetary policy has kind of reached the end of what it can do, and that now the focus has to be on what fiscal policy can do, how we can distribute resources, not just to alleviate poverty and insecurity, but also to help drive productivity, to help us make the shift to a zero carbon economy, meet the challenge of climate change, invest in our public health infrastructures. I think there's a lot of consensus on that, even if there's disagreement about some of the modern monetary theory debates we've had also in the course of this conference. A lot of consistency too in the requirement or the argument put today that we need a kind of really radical transformation in our social security system, whatever that looks like. And arguments for and against basic income, just as we've heard, arguments for social insurance schemes, arguments for universality and means testing for combinations of them. But nonetheless, a consistent theme that this crisis and what came before it have demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that our social security systems are, particularly in countries like the UK, are in need of substantial reform, that they simply don't work. They don't give people security, they give them insecurity, they don't give them dignity, and they have all sorts of holes in them. So there's a lot of consensus on that. And I'll end really just on this sort of optimistic note that Gavin Kelly started us off this morning with, when he quoted the historian Gershom Scholem, who said, here's a moment in history where we are facing plastic hours, where moments when it's possible to act, and if you do and if you can act, then something happens. And in the end, with all of these things, we come back to the contingency of politics. We come back to the possibility of change being dependent on social movements, politics, political actors, political leaders acting together to make change happen. It comes back to us in the end. But debates of this kind, I hope, give people food for thought in those processes of change. I hope they contribute to a wider public discussion and debate. And I want just to end by thanking Neal for chairing that session so brilliantly. Thank you to Polly, to the two Johns for their brilliant contributions. Thanks to everybody else that's joined us today. I want to pay particular thanks to the Bristol Festival of Ideas, to Andrew Kelly, to Naomi and to Amy for all their organisation of this event. I know it's not easy and they put loads of time and effort into doing it. So thank you very much indeed. To my own colleagues at the Institute for Policy Research, to Amy and Sophie, in particular to Ada and Jane and others who spoke today. Again, a huge amount of effort. To our colleague Jeff Crocker, who has been on the panel today, made lots of connections and comments, and also a great supporter of our work in this area. So thank you to all of you. But finally, just to thank everybody that's joined us. To finish on 517 people, with all sorts of chats in the bar going down, shows that there's an awful lot of appetite and enthusiasm for this discussion. So many thanks for joining us today. Do keep in touch with our work at the University of Bath, at the Institute for Policy Research, but also the Festival of Ideas. Everything that's been up today will be broadcast and available to look at again. So Don't worry if you missed anything. There will be material available for you to look at. The Bristol Festival of Ideas is already posting links on all of those things. So lots of stuff you can come back to if you want to catch up on things that have happened today, if you missed anything or just want to look at it again. So thanks very much indeed, everybody. Have a good evening, and let's keep this discussion going, and let's make some desperately needed change happen in our society. Thank you very much.